There is something almost impossible about the fact that you are here. Not here in the sense of this channel or this evening or wherever you have settled in to listen. Here in the deeper sense. Here as in alive, breathing, warm, wrapped in whatever comfort you have made for yourself tonight in a world where most of the things that have killed most of the people who ever lived are for you right now, not a present danger. That is not how it used to be. For most of the time that human beings have walked this planet, survival was not a background condition. It was the work, the daily, relentless, exhausting, uncertain work. And most people, most generations across most of history, were not particularly good at it, not because they lacked intelligence or will, but because the world they lived in was by almost any measure we can apply today genuinely and comprehensively dangerous in ways that are now nearly impossible to imagine from where you are sitting. This video is about that world. Not a single war, not one plague, not one empire that rose and fell, all of it. The full weight of what it actually meant to be human before the age of antibiotics, before clean water, before the understanding of germ theory, before weather forecasting, before the slow and grinding accumulation of all the ordinary knowledge that now sits invisibly between you and death. We are going to trace the specific forces, biological, geological, climatic and human, that made the ancient and deep past so lethal by modern standards. And we're going to do it carefully, because this is not a story that benefits from exaggeration. The reality is striking enough on its own. Here is one place to begin. A child born in the ancient world, anywhere, any culture, any continent, any century before roughly the last 200 years, had on average somewhere between a 1 in 3 and a 1 in 2 chance of dying before their 5th birthday. Not dying eventually, as all of us will, dying before they had any real chance to live, dying of things that a modern emergency room would treat in an afternoon. That number is not a tragedy confined to the poorest or most marginal people. It is an average across the full span of human experience. Across the farming villages of Neolithic Europe and the walled cities of ancient China and the river settlements of Mesopotamia and the highland communities of the pre-Columbian Americas. The specific numbers shift depending on the region and the era and what the archaeological record happens to preserve. But the shape of the story does not change. Most people did not live long. Most people lived in the presence of death in a way that we have quietly and gradually engineered out of daily experience. And the question this video wants to sit with, slowly over the hours ahead, is not just what killed them, but what it felt like to inhabit a world where these forces were simply the conditions of existence, not emergencies, not catastrophes, though catastrophes certainly came, just life. Just the ordinary texture of being alive before the modern world decided piecemeal and imperfectly that some of this was preventable. If this is the kind of history you've been looking for, deep, unhurried, honest about what the evidence actually shows, take a moment now to subscribe and leave a like. It makes a real difference to how this work reaches people. And if you feel moved to leave a comment, where are you listening from tonight and what brought you to this particular story? I find myself genuinely curious. Now settle in somewhere comfortable. We have a long way to go and none of it needs to be rushed. So, where does a story like this one begin? You could begin with the biology, with the fact that the human body, which is in so many ways a remarkable piece of engineering, is also almost comically vulnerable to a very long list of things that the pre-modern world contained in abundance. Bacteria that colonize a wound and travel toward the blood. Parasites that take up residence in the gut and quietly starve their hosts over years. Viruses that the body has never encountered before and has no framework to resist. Teeth which are the source of more ancient suffering than almost any other single anatomical feature capable of generating infections that reach the jaw and the skull and the bloodstream with a speed that seems in retrospect almost punishing. The body that ancient people carried through their lives was the same body you carry now. It has not changed in any meaningful way in the tens of thousands of years we are concerned with. What changed slowly and then faster is the environment that body has to navigate. You could begin with the planet itself, because the Earth that humans have inhabited for the last several 100,000 years was not a stable or forgiving stage for their activities. It was and remains a geologically active, climatically variable, volcanically capable system that has on multiple occasions across deep time done things that killed enormous numbers of people without any particular warning and without any interest in the civilizations that happened to be in the way. There are climate events in the human past so severe that they show up in the tree rings of trees growing on opposite sides of the planet. There are volcanic eruptions whose ash layers appear in ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica simultaneously. There are mega droughts that lasted not 1 year, but 100 collapsing agricultural systems that entire cities depended on and leaving behind populations that simply could not continue in the places they had built. Or you could begin with other people. Because one of the most unsettling things that the last several decades of archaeological research have revealed is that violence, not occasional, not exceptional, but patterned, organized, and widespread, appears to have been a feature of human life in the deep past at rates that are genuinely difficult to reconcile with older, gentler narratives about ancient peoples living in some kind of harmony before the complications of statehood and empire arrived to disturb them. The skeletons tell a different story. They tell it quietly in the language of healed fractures and unhealed ones of blade marks on bone and arrowheads lodged in ribs of mass graves that predate any city by thousands of years. This video will move through all of it. We are going to begin with the planet, with the geological and atmospheric conditions that formed the stage on which all human suffering played out. Then we are going to turn to the body and to disease and to famine, and to the specific climatic catastrophes that punctuated ancient history with a regularity that the people experiencing them had no framework to predict or explain. We are going to spend time with the archaeological record, with what the bones and the sediment cores and the ancient genomes have revealed about how dangerous ordinary life actually was. And we are going to sit with the honest scholarly disagreements because this is a subject where the evidence is rich and the interpretations are sometimes fiercely contested, and that tension is part of what makes it worth understanding. But we are also, and this is perhaps the part that matters most, going to ask how people survived, because they did. The odds against any individual life reaching adulthood, and adulthood reaching old age, and old age producing children who would themselves survive long enough to produce children of their own, were in certain eras and regions almost vanishingly small. And yet here you are, the end of an unbroken chain of survival that stretches back through everything we are about to describe, through the plagues and the famines and the winters that lasted 3 years and the infections that moved through entire populations like fire through dry grass. Every single person in that chain made it. Against everything the world could arrange against them, they made it. There is something worth knowing in that. What happens next, in the part of this story just ahead, is where the ground itself begins to speak. Because before the diseases and before the hunger and before anything that humans did to one another, there was the planet. And the planet had been at work for a very long time before we arrived, shaping conditions that we would inherit without understanding, building a world that was magnificent and indifferent in equal measure. Long before the first city, long before the first field of cultivated grain, long before any human being looked up at the sky and tried to give a name to what they saw there, the Earth was already in the middle of something. It had been in the middle of something for a very long time. The planet that human beings eventually inherited was not designed for their comfort. It was not designed at all, of course, that is the point. It was the product of processes so old and so indifferent to biology that even the word ancient feels inadequate for them. The core still churns, the tectonic plates still move grinding against one another along boundaries that run beneath some of the most densely populated land on Earth. The atmosphere is still, in geological terms, a relatively recent and somewhat fragile arrangement. And the climate, the single variable that more than any other determines whether human beings can grow food, find water, and survive a given winter, has never been as stable as the last 10,000 years have led us to assume it is. That last point is worth pausing on because it tends to surprise people. The period of human history we usually concern ourselves with, from the first agricultural settlements through the Bronze Age, the classical civilizations, the medieval world, and into the early modern period, happens to fall within an unusually stable stretch of global climate called the Holocene. The Holocene began roughly 11,700 years ago, at the end of the last major ice age, and it gave humanity a narrow window of relative warmth and predictability within which civilization as we understand it became possible. Agriculture, settled communities, writing, all of it grew in that window. But even within the Holocene, even within that span of relative stability, the climate was not still. It moved. It shifted. It tightened without warning, and when it shifted, it did not send a notice ahead of time. Around 4,200 years ago, a date that climate scientists and archaeologists now refer to simply as the 4.2 kilo year event, something changed in the pattern of atmospheric circulation across much of the northern hemisphere. The mechanism is still debated. What is not debated is what followed. A prolonged drought lasting somewhere between 100 and 200 years, depending on the region and the proxy record being examined, swept across an enormous arc of the ancient world. It reached from the eastern Mediterranean through the Middle East and deep into Central Asia, and it appears to have struck the Nile Valley, the Indus River Valley, and the Great Plains of northern China more or less simultaneously. The Akkadian Empire, which was at that point the largest political structure the world had yet produced, stretching across what is now Iraq and parts of Syria and Iran, appears to have collapsed within a generation. Excavations at the site of Tel Leilan in northeastern Syria uncovered a thick layer of wind-blown dust sitting directly above the remains of what had been a thriving agricultural town. The dust layer contains no organic material. No seeds, no animal bones, no evidence of human activity at all. The town was not destroyed, it was simply abandoned. The people left because the rain stopped coming, and then they did not return for 300 years. The evidence from this period is genuinely striking, and it arrives from multiple independent sources: lakes, sediment, cores, cave stalagmites, ice cores, pollen records, archaeological stratigraphy, all of which converge on the same rough window of disruption. What they cannot tell us, at least not yet, is precisely why the drought happened. Scholars still debate whether the trigger was a shift in the pattern of monsoon circulation, a sequence of unusually powerful volcanic eruptions that cooled the upper atmosphere, or some combination of feedback effects that our models have not yet fully reconstructed. The evidence points clearly at the event. The cause remains genuinely uncertain. What is clear is that the 4.2 kilo-year event was not unique. It was one in a series of climatic disruptions that punctuated the Holocene at irregular intervals, each one capable of overwhelming agricultural systems that had no reserves and no fallback. The climate of the ancient world was more stable than what came before it in deep geological time, more stable than the Pleistocene ice ages that preceded it by tens of thousands of years. But stable is a relative term, and relative stability when you are a farming community with 2 weeks of stored grain and no understanding of why the rains have failed offers very little comfort. There is one disruption in particular that sits at the edge of recorded history, and casts a shadow long enough that traces of it appear in the chronicles of cultures that had no knowledge of one another. In the year 536 of the Common Era, something went wrong with the sun. Not with the sun itself. The sun continued to function exactly as it always had. What changed was the atmosphere between the sun and the surface of the earth. A massive volcanic eruption, or possibly a sequence of eruptions, injected enough sulfur dioxide and ash into the stratosphere to reduce the amount of solar radiation reaching the ground across the entire northern hemisphere. The sky, by multiple contemporary accounts from Constantinople to China to Ireland, turned a dull, flat colour that was not quite blue and not quite grey. Crops failed, temperatures dropped, snow fell in China in August. The Byzantine historian Procopius, writing from within the event itself, described the sun giving light without heat like the moon, a detail that is more scientifically precise than Procopius probably realized because it describes almost exactly what stratospheric aerosol loading does to incoming solar radiation. What followed the year 536 was not a single bad harvest. It was a cascade. The cold and the crop failures of the late 530s and early 540s weakened populations across the northern hemisphere at precisely the moment that the Justinianic plague, the first great pandemic of bubonic plague in recorded history, was beginning its movement out of Central Asia and into the Mediterranean world. The two catastrophes were not causally linked in any direct sense, but they arrived together, and together they produced a mortality event that some historians now regard as the single most destructive episode in human history per unit of time. The population of the Mediterranean basin may have fallen by as much as a quarter within a single generation. The evidence remains incomplete and the estimates vary considerably depending on the methodology used to construct them, but the broad shape of the story is no longer seriously contested. The planet was not trying to kill anyone. It is important to hold on to that. The Earth does not have intentions. The climate does not bear grudges. The volcanic system that injected that veil of sulfur into the atmosphere in the 6th century was not aware of the Byzantine Empire, or of the children who would go to sleep hungry that winter, or of the farmers who would plant their fields the following spring and watch nothing come up. These are not stories of malice. They are stories of indifference, which is in some ways harder to absorb than malice would be. Malice at least implies an agent. Indifference implies only scale. And yet the people who lived through these events were not indifferent. They mourned, they adapted, they moved, they invented explanations, religious, astronomical, agricultural, that made sense within the frameworks they had available. They could not know that the dimming of their sun was the result of a volcanic eruption on the other side of the world. They knew only that the light had changed and the cold had come and the food was running short. What they did with that knowledge, how they organized who they blamed, which communities survived and which ones scattered, is part of what makes the human record of these centuries so worth examining. The planet set the terms. The people had to respond. And as we move deeper into this story, the question shifts from what the Earth was capable of doing to what the human body was capable of enduring, because the biology of survival in the ancient world operated under pressures that were in their quiet and constant way, just as formidable as anything the climate could arrange. Consider the teeth. It is an unusual place to begin a meditation on human vulnerability, perhaps, but the teeth are where so much of the ancient story of suffering quietly starts. Not in battlefields or plague pits or famine years, though all of those will come, but in the mouth, in the slow grinding work of a jaw that has been processing coarse grain and dried meat and whatever else a person in the ancient world could find to eat day after day, decade after decade, wearing down enamel that will never grow back. developing cavities that in the modern world a dentist addresses in 40 minutes, and that in the ancient world simply deepened season by season until they reached the pulp and the pulp became infected, and the infection found a path into the jaw and the jaw became a highway into the bloodstream. Paleopathologists, the researchers who study ancient disease and injury through skeletal remains, have found evidence of severe dental disease in virtually every population they have examined across the full span of human prehistory and recorded history. Not occasional evidence, pervasive evidence. Skulls from Neolithic farming villages in Central Europe show rates of cavitation and tooth loss that would be considered a public health crisis by modern standards. Egyptian mummies from across several dynasties, individuals who were in many cases among the most privileged and well-fed people in their society, show dental wear so extreme that the enamel has been entirely ground away on the molars, exposing the dentine beneath. The culprit in the Egyptian case appears to have been the sand and grit that found its way into flour during the grinding process, acting as an abrasive with every meal for every year of a person's life. The pharaoh and the labourer, in this one respect, suffered more or less equally. What this means in practical terms is not simply pain, though. The pain would have been extraordinary and unrelenting by the time an infection took hold. It means that a significant proportion of ancient people were living with a chronic low-grade septic condition originating in the mouth, one that placed a constant burden on the immune system, contributed to systemic inflammation, and in a meaningful number of cases would eventually produce an abscess severe enough to kill. There is a skeleton from a medieval English cemetery, one of many thousands excavated across northern Europe, of a man who appears to have been in his mid-30s, whose cause of death the forensic team attributed with reasonable confidence to a dental abscess that had spread into the neck and blocked the airway. He was in all likelihood otherwise healthy. He died because a tooth went wrong and there was nothing that could be done about it. That is the texture of the ancient body's vulnerability, not always dramatic, often quiet, slow and cumulative. A wound that does not quite close, a cough that settles in for the winter, a tooth that aches for years before it becomes something worse. The body in the pre-modern world was not different from the body you inhabit now, and that's precisely the point. The same machinery running without the maintenance systems that modern medicine has built around it. The skeleton is in a sense the most honest document the past has left us. It does not exaggerate. It does not have a political purpose. It simply records in calcium and phosphate what happened to a person during their lifetime, the illnesses they survived, the injuries they absorbed, the nutritional deprivations that left their marks in the density of the bone and the interruptions of the tooth enamel. There is a feature called Harris lines, thin horizontal bands visible on radiograph scans of ancient long bones, that form when a child's growth is interrupted by an illness or starvation and then resumes. The lines are the record of the interruption. In many ancient populations, the long bones of children and adolescents are dense with them, sometimes showing 4 or 5 distinct episodes of growth arrest before adulthood. What that tells us is not simply that ancient children were sometimes sick or hungry. It tells us that most ancient children were sick or hungry repeatedly in a rhythm that tracked the agricultural calendar, the disease season, and the unpredictability of rainfall. One of the more quietly startling findings to emerge from bioarchaeology in recent decades is the relationship between the adoption of agriculture and the measurable decline in human skeletal health. For most of the 20th century, the standard narrative held that farming was on balance, a straightforward improvement on the hunter-gatherer existence that preceded it. More food, more reliable food, larger populations, progress. The skeletal record complicates this considerably. Populations that made the transition from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture show almost universally across the sites where the comparison can be made a reduction in average stature, an increase in dental disease, a higher rate of the enamel defects associated with nutritional stress in childhood, and a greater prevalence of infectious disease markers in the bone. The hunter-gatherer skeletons as a group tend to be taller, better nourished, and less marked by chronic disease than the farming skeletons that succeed them at the same geographic locations. The reason, when you think about it, is not mysterious. Hunter-gatherers ate a wide variety of foods, dozens of plant species, multiple animal sources, a dietary breadth that delivered a range of nutrients that no single staple crop can replicate. When they moved into a region of farming settlement or were gradually displaced by one, the diet narrowed to whatever the local agricultural system produced. In much of the ancient world, that meant grain. Grain provided calories. It did not provide everything else, and in settled communities, people and animals and waste and water sources existed in much closer proximity than they had in mobile foraging groups, which meant that the pathogens that thrive in density, the intestinal parasites, the waterborne bacteria, the respiratory infections that move easily through crowded winter quarters, had access to populations that had not previously been exposed to them in significant concentrations. Scholars still debate the pace and the geography of this transition, and the picture is not uniform across all regions or all time periods. There are farming communities in the archaeological record whose skeletal health compares favourably with neighbouring forager populations, and there are hunter-gatherer groups whose remains show significant stress markers of their own. The relationship between subsistence strategy and health is not simple, and anyone who presents it as a clean before and after story is smoothing over a great deal of genuine complexity. But the broad pattern holds across enough independent sites and enough independent research groups that it has become one of the more robust findings in the field. The shift to agriculture, for all the population growth it enabled, came with a biological cost that was paid in real bodies in real lifetimes for thousands of years. Childbirth sits at the centre of this story in a way that deserves its own quiet acknowledgement. For most of human history, giving birth was the single most dangerous thing that the majority of women would ever do. The estimates vary by region and era, and the evidence is necessarily incomplete, but the figures that emerge from the best-studied historical populations suggest that somewhere between 1 and 2 women died for every 100 live births in most pre-modern societies, a rate that compounded across a lifetime of multiple pregnancies translated into a lifetime risk of maternal death that was in many populations somewhere between 5 and 10%. That is not a background statistic. That is a defining feature of what it meant to be a woman in the ancient world. Every pregnancy was a negotiation with a real and present danger, and every woman who survived it knew, because she had seen it, what the alternative looked like. The infants who survived birth entered a world in which the next 5 years would be the most dangerous of their lives. Weaning was a particular crisis point. The moment when the passive immunity transferred through breast milk was withdrawn, and the child's own immune system had to begin managing exposure to the full repertoire of pathogens in their environment. In populations where weaning happened early by modern standards, and where the weaning foods were contaminated water and softened grain rather than anything nutritionally complete, the mortality spike in the 2nd and 3rd year of life is visible in the skeletal record as a distinct cluster of small graves. Archaeologists working in ancient cemetery sites have noted it repeatedly. The children who die at 1, 2 and 3 years old are present in numbers that are entirely disproportionate to any other age group. A silent census of the moment when the protection of infancy ended and the world began. The body then was not simply fragile in the ancient world, it was fragile in specific patterned ways that the evidence allows us to trace with some precision. And understanding those patterns, understanding exactly where the human form was most exposed to the conditions of the pre-modern world, is the necessary foundation for everything that follows. because the diseases that swept through ancient populations did not move through healthy, well-nourished bodies with fully functioning immune systems. They moved through bodies that were already carrying the accumulated weight of everything just described. And that changes the story considerably. What those diseases were, how they moved, and what they cost. That is a richer and more intricate accounting than it might first appear. The biology of epidemic illness in the ancient world is not simply a list of pathogens. It is a story about the relationship between human density, animal proximity, immune history, and the specific vulnerabilities that agriculture and settlement quietly assembled over centuries. That story begins in a place that is in some ways even more intimate than the body itself. Somewhere in the ancient world, at a moment that no record preserves, a virus crossed from an animal into a human being for the first time. It was not a dramatic event. There was no visible boundary crossed, no sensation of threshold, no awareness on the part of either the animal or the person that something consequential had just occurred. A farmer handling livestock, a hunter dressing a kill, a child playing near a pen of goats or pigs or cattle in one of the newly dense agricultural settlements that had begun over the preceding millennia to change the relationship between human beings and the other species they lived among. The crossing happened in an instant, in an ordinary moment, and then it moved. This is where epidemic disease in the human story actually begins, not with plague or pestilence as dramatic visitations from outside ordinary life, but with density, with proximity, with the slow and entirely logical consequence of what happens when human beings decide to live in large numbers in fixed locations alongside domesticated animals, in conditions where water sources and waste and living quarters are all within a short distance of one another. The diseases that would go on to define the mortality landscape of the ancient and medieval world did not come from nowhere. They came from that arrangement. And the arrangement was from almost every other perspective an enormous success. Measles in its modern form requires a population of roughly 500,000 people living in sustained contact with one another in order to maintain transmission. Below that threshold, the virus burns through available hosts too quickly and extinguishes itself. This is a feature that epidemiologists call the critical community size, and its implications for ancient history are worth sitting with for a moment. It means that measles as a continuously circulating human pathogen could not have existed before cities large enough to sustain it. The best current estimates, drawing on both molecular clock analysis of the measles genome and the historical record of ancient disease descriptions, suggest that measles diverged from a cattle virus, most likely the rinderpest virus which devastated bovine populations for centuries, sometime around the first millennium of the Common Era, possibly earlier. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete, and the dating is contested among virologists and historians of medicine who approach the question from different angles. But the broad implication is striking one of the most recognizable childhood diseases of the modern world, the one that killed tens of millions of people before a vaccine was developed in the 1960s did not exist as a human pathogen until human civilization had grown dense enough to support it. That pattern, the pathogen shaped by the conditions of settlement, recurs throughout the ancient disease record with a consistency that begins to feel like a natural law. Smallpox, which over the course of its long history as a human disease may have killed more people than any other single infectious agent, shows molecular evidence of diverging from a rodent pox virus possibly in northeastern Africa or the Indian subcontinent within a window of time that places its emergence somewhere in the last few thousand years. Typhoid and cholera and dysentery are diseases of contaminated water, diseases, in other words, of precisely the conditions that dense agricultural settlement created, and that mobile foraging groups drawing from a constantly changing set of water sources were largely protected from by the nature of their movement. Tuberculosis is a disease of close and prolonged indoor contact. Its prevalence in ancient populations tracks with quiet consistency the shift toward winter housing in which many people and sometimes many animals shared enclosed space for months at a time. The Roman world offers one of the most richly documented examples of what epidemic disease looked like at the scale of a large interconnected civilization. The Antonine Plague, which arrived in the Roman Empire in the year 165 of the Common Era and persisted in waves for roughly 15 years, is thought by most modern medical historians to have been smallpox, or possibly measles, or a combination of both moving through a population that had encountered neither before. The physician Galen, who was practicing in Rome during the outbreak and whose clinical descriptions survive recorded symptoms that are consistent with a hemorrhagic poxvirus fever, diarrhea, inflammation of the throat, and a characteristic skin eruption that appeared on the 9th day of illness. At its peak, the plague was reportedly killing as many as 2,000 people per day in the city of Rome alone. The total death toll across the empire over the full duration of the outbreak is estimated at somewhere between 5 and 10 million people. The range of that estimate reflects the genuine difficulty of reconstructing ancient mortality from incomplete sources. The evidence points at scale but cannot specify it with precision. What the Antonine Plague reveals when you look at it carefully is not simply the lethality of a novel pathogen moving through a susceptible population. It reveals something about the specific vulnerability that empire creates. The Roman road network, which was one of the greatest engineering achievements of the ancient world, and which moved goods armies and people with a speed and regularity that no previous civilization had managed, also moved disease. Every returning soldier was a potential vector. Every merchant convoy linking the eastern provinces to the western ones was a biological corridor. The same connectivity that made Rome wealthy and militarily powerful made it epidemiologically exposed in a way that smaller, more isolated communities were not. The infrastructure of civilization was also without intending to be the infrastructure of contagion. The Justinianic plague, which has already appeared briefly in the story of the 6th century's climate catastrophe, was something different again, and in some ways more consequential than almost any other single disease event in the human record. It was caused by Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague, and it represents the first confirmed pandemic of that organism in human history. The plague arrived in the Byzantine Empire through the port of Pelusium in Egypt in the year 541 of the Common Era, moving along the same maritime trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, and through the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean world beyond. Within a year it had reached Constantinople, where the historian Procopius described the city burying its dead in mass graves because individual burial had become impossible, and where the Emperor Justinian himself fell ill, though he recovered. From Constantinople it spread through the remaining Roman territories into Persia and eventually across most of Europe. What makes the Justinianic plague particularly worth understanding is not simply its death toll, though the toll was enormous. Current estimates drawing on paleo-epidemiological data, as well as textual sources, suggest that the first wave alone may have killed between 25 and 50 million people across the affected regions. What makes it worth understanding is what happened after. The plague did not arrive once and leave. It returned, again and again in recurrent waves that continued for roughly 200 years, cycling back through populations that had partially recovered, killing the young, who had no previous exposure, reshaping the demographic and economic landscape of the post-Roman world in ways that scholars are still tracing. Some historians now argue that the Justinianic plague did more to end the ancient world and inaugurate what we call the medieval period than any military conquest or political collapse. The Roman Empire in the east, the Byzantine Empire, never fully recovered its pre-plague population during the period the plague was active. The cities shrank. The tax base contracted. The great ambition of Justinian to reconquer the Western Empire which had seemed briefly achievable in the 530s, became quietly impossible in the demographic wreckage of the 540s and beyond. There is something almost difficult to hold on to in that sequence of cause and effect. A bacterium living in the gut of fleas that lived on rats that travelled in the grain ships of the ancient world's most sophisticated trading network reshaped the political history of Europe for the next 5 centuries. It did not intend to. It was simply doing what organisms do, finding hosts, replicating, moving on. The geopolitical consequences were a side effect of biology, nothing more. And yet the consequences were real. The maps changed, the languages changed. The religious landscape of the Mediterranean changed. All of it downstream from a pathogen that no one in the 6th century could see in a flea that no one thought to look at on a rat that no one considered dangerous. Scholars continue to refine this picture as ancient genomic data becomes available from more burial sites across more regions. The molecular archaeology of the Justinianic plague has advanced considerably in the last decade, with researchers extracting and sequencing Yersinia pestis deoxyribonucleic acid from the teeth of plague victims buried in sites from Bavaria to Britain, confirming that the same bacterial strain was moving across the full geographic range that the textual sources describe. The evidence for once is unusually clear. What remains less certain is the precise mortality in any given region, the mechanisms by which the plague cycled and returned, and the degree to which the demographic collapse it caused can be disentangled from the other pressures. The climate disruption of the preceding decade, the military exhaustion of decades of war that were bearing down on the same population simultaneously. The body, as it turned out, was only part of the story. The diseases moved through bodies, yes, but they moved through something else first, through the landscapes those bodies inhabited, through the food systems that sustained them, through the accumulated weight of seasons that did not go as expected. And the weight of a failed season in the ancient world was not an inconvenience, it was a sentence. Grain made civilization possible. Grain also made famine inevitable. That is not a paradox so much as a description of the same mechanism viewed from 2 different angles. The moment a human community committed itself to cultivating a single staple crop, or even 2 or 3, it gained something extraordinary, the ability to feed far more people from a given area of land than hunting and gathering had ever allowed. It gained storage, it gained surplus. It gained eventually the leisure time that surplus creates, and from that leisure time came writing and mathematics and monumental architecture and everything else we associate with the word civilization. But it gave something up in the same transaction. It gave up the dietary breadth and the geographic flexibility that had for hundreds of thousands of years been the primary human strategy for surviving a bad season. A foraging group facing a failed resource in one area could move. A city of 50,000 people with granaries that were running low could not. Famine in the ancient world was not an interruption of normal life. It was a structural feature of it, built into the system, not inevitable in any given year, but inevitable over time. As certain across a long enough span of years as the rainfall variability that no ancient agricultural society had the tools to fully buffer against. The question for any settled community was never entirely whether a famine would come. It was whether the community would be prepared enough, organized enough, and fortunate enough in its timing to survive it when it did. The mechanisms were straightforward and merciless. Grain crops are vulnerable to drought, to excess rain at the wrong moment in the growing cycle, to late frosts that kill seedlings, to fungal blights that move through standing wheat with a speed that can devastate an entire region's harvest in a matter of days. Ergot, a fungal infection of rye and other grains, deserves particular attention here, because it is one of the more quietly horrifying features of the pre-modern agricultural world, and one that most general histories pass over. Ergo produces alkaloids that, when consumed in sufficient quantity through contaminated bread, cause a condition known historically as St. Anthony's fire, a syndrome that includes intense burning sensations in the limbs, convulsions, hallucinations, and in severe cases dry gangrene that causes fingers and toes and entire extremities to blacken and fall away. The ergot alkaloids are vasoconstrictors, meaning they constrict the blood vessels to the point where circulation to the extremities is cut off entirely. Medieval chronicles describe communities in which dozens or hundreds of people simultaneously experienced what appeared to be spontaneous burning and the loss of limbs without any visible wound or injury to account for it. The cause, contaminated grain consumed because there was nothing else, was not understood for centuries. People ate what they had. What they had was sometimes killing them. Ergot outbreaks were most common in years of wet, cool summers, when the fungus thrives, and they were most dangerous in the years immediately following a poor harvest, when grain stores were low and the threshold for consuming questionable food was correspondingly higher. The precise frequency of significant ergot events in the medieval period is difficult to reconstruct. The condition was often attributed to supernatural causes, or confused with other illnesses in contemporary records. But the outbreaks that are clearly documented cluster in the colder, wetter decades, suggesting a climate connection that modern researchers have traced in the historical record with reasonable confidence. The great famines of the ancient and medieval world operated at a different scale than ergot, though the underlying mechanism, a disruption of the food supply in a system with no adequate backup, was the same. The famine that struck northern China between the years 1076 and 1008, of the Common Era, is estimated to have killed somewhere in the range of 4 to 10 million people. Though the uncertainty in that figure is genuinely large and reflects the difficulty of working from census records and administrative documents that were themselves incomplete. The Great Famine that struck northern Europe between 1315 and 1322, immediately preceding by about a decade the arrival of the Black Death, killed somewhere between 10 and 25% of the population of the affected regions over 7 years of consecutive harvest failures driven by a dramatic and prolonged shift in the climate of the North Atlantic. In some areas, the mortality was concentrated enough that entire villages were abandoned before the plague arrived, leaving the Black Death to move through a landscape that was already depleted. That sequence, famine followed by plague, is one of the recurring patterns in the pre-modern mortality record, and it reflects a biological logic that is not difficult to follow once you see it. A famine-weakened population is an immunologically compromised one. Children who have spent a year or 2 years in caloric deficit, whose bodies have been drawing down their reserves to maintain basic function, whose immune systems are running on reduced capacity, are dramatically more vulnerable to infectious disease than they would otherwise be. Adults who have lost significant body mass are similarly exposed. The famine and the plague are not separate events in the lives of the people experiencing them. They are sequential blows landing on the same already damaged body. What is perhaps less obvious and worth dwelling on is the social dimension of famine, the way that food shortage does not simply reduce calories across a population uniformly, but reshapes the entire social order of a community in ways that determine who lives and who does not. In most ancient and medieval societies, access to food in a crisis tracked social hierarchy with an ugly precision. The wealthy had stored grain. They had diversified assets, livestock land in multiple locations, access to long-distance trade networks that could import food from regions where the harvest had been better. The poor had the current year's wages and whatever they could grow on whatever land they were permitted to work. When the harvest failed, the wealthy tightened their belts, the poor starved. This is not a simple story of villains and victims, though the inequity is real, and the historical record documents it with painful clarity. is also a story about the structural limits of pre-modern governance and logistics. Even rulers who genuinely wished to prevent famine mortality among their populations, and many did for reasons that mixed genuine concern with the practical recognition that dead subjects pay no taxes and field no armies, found themselves operating with tools that were entirely inadequate to the scale of the problem. Moving grain in the ancient and medieval world required pack animals, carts and roads, all of which moved slowly, all of which were expensive and none of which could respond to a harvest failure with anything like the speed the crisis demanded. By the time a relief effort arrived in a famine-stricken region, the most vulnerable people had often already died. The Roman imperial government developed one of the most sophisticated grain supply systems the ancient world produced. The Annona, a state-organized mechanism for importing Egyptian grain to feed the population of Rome, which by the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era had grown to somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, far beyond what the surrounding Italian countryside could support. The Annona was a genuine engineering of food security, and it worked for the most part as long as the empire's administrative capacity and naval infrastructure remained intact. What it could not do was extend that security to the rural populations of the provinces, who remained as exposed to local harvest failure as any farming community anywhere. The city was fed, the countryside managed as best it could. Scholars still debate the degree to which famine rather than plague or military pressure was the primary driver of population decline in various periods of ancient history. The two catastrophes interact in the historical record in ways that make them genuinely difficult to disentangle, and the evidence for famine mortality specifically, as opposed to mortality from the diseases that follow famine, is harder to read directly from the skeletal record than evidence for infectious disease. What the isotopic analysis of ancient bones does show clearly and consistently across multiple populations is the signature of chronic nutritional stress. Lower levels of certain stable isotopes in bone collagen, reduced bone density, the growth interruption markers already described. The bodies that were most vulnerable to the plagues were already in many cases the bodies that hunger had been quietly weakening for years. The rhythm of life in the ancient agricultural world was in this sense a rhythm of accumulation and depletion. Good years built reserves in the granary, in the body, in the social fabric of a community that had enough. Bad years drew those reserves down. A sequence of bad years drew them down past the point of recovery, and past that point the mathematics became unforgiving. The human cost was not only in the dying, it was in the generation of children who survived the famine years stunted, immunocompromised and carrying in their bones the record of what those years had cost them. They would spend the rest of their lives more vulnerable than they should have been, more susceptible to the next illness, less able to work at full capacity, passing on to their own children bodies that had been shaped by scarcity in ways that took generations to work through. And yet, and this is the thing that the bones also show in their own quiet way, people kept going. They planted again the following spring. They rebuilt what the bad years had taken. They found somehow within the limited toolkit of pre-modern agriculture and pre-modern social organization enough resilience to continue. The human capacity for persistence in the face of conditions that seem from this distance almost incompatible with continuation is one of the genuine and recurring wonders of the historical record. What made that persistence possible is part of what this story is building toward. But before we reach the question of how people survived, there is still the matter of what else was waiting for them. Beyond the failures of harvest, beyond the pathogens that moved through weakened bodies in the deep substrate of the world itself, where forces of an entirely different magnitude had been accumulating on their own timescale, patient and immense. The ground beneath a city does not announce what it is about to do. There is no warning in the ordinary texture of a morning, no change in the light, no shift in the smell of the air, no signal that the stability that has held for a generation or a century or 1,000 years is in the next few minutes about to end. The earth simply moves. And when it moves beneath a city, the city discovers in a very short space of time how much of what it believed about its own permanence was a kind of assumption that the geology beneath it had simply not yet contradicted. We have already traced the ways that climate and disease and hunger worked their slow pressures on ancient populations, forces that operated across years and decades that gave people at least the possibility of adaptation, however limited. What the geological and seismic record adds to this picture is something different in character: the sudden event. The catastrophe that arrives without prior negotiation and completes its work before any response is possible. And the ancient world was not short of them. The Eastern Mediterranean sits on one of the most seismically active zones on Earth, the Anatolian Fault System. The boundary between the African and Eurasian tectonic plates that runs beneath the Aegean Sea and extends into the Middle East has been generating significant earthquakes for as long as human beings have been building things worth destroying. The ancient cities of this region, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Phoenician, Persian, were built on ground that moved regularly and sometimes catastrophically, and their history reflects that fact in ways that the standard narrative of classical civilization tends to understate. The city of Antioch, which was one of the largest and most important cities of the Roman and early Byzantine world, at its peak perhaps the third or fourth most populous city in the Mediterranean after Rome and Alexandria, was destroyed by earthquake at least 5 times across the span of its recorded history. 5 times the population rebuilt, 5 times the ground took it back. The earthquake of 526 of the Common Era, which struck during the celebration of the Ascension, and therefore gathered an unusual concentration of people inside public buildings, killed somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 people by the estimates of ancient sources. Though modern historians apply those figures with appropriate caution, given the tendency of ancient chroniclers to round toward the dramatic, what is striking about Antioch is not simply the death toll of any single event. It is the persistence. The city was rebuilt after each destruction because the location was too valuable to abandon, positioned at the convergence of trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to the east, watered by the Orontes River, sheltered by mountains to the north. The geography that made the site dangerous was inseparable from the geography that made it desirable, and so people returned generation after generation to build again on ground that had already proven it would not hold. This is not irrationality, it is the ordinary human calculation of risk versus necessity made by people who had no better option and who, in the absence of modern seismological understanding, had no framework for estimating how often the worst would come. The volcanic dimension of the ancient world's geological violence operates on a somewhat different timescale, and its effects are in some ways more geographically diffuse and therefore harder to trace in the historical record with precision. A major earthquake destroys a city. A major volcanic eruption can alter the climate of an entire hemisphere for years. We have already touched on the eruption or eruptions behind the darkness of 536 of the Common Era, but the longer history of volcanism as a force in human affairs extends much further back and covers a wider geographic range than any single event can represent. The eruption of the Ilopango volcano in what is now El Salvador, which most current estimates place somewhere in the 5th or 6th century of the Common Era. The dating remains genuinely contested, with different research groups placing it anywhere from the 3rd to the 6th century depending on the proxy data they prioritize, was one of the largest volcanic events in the last several thousand years, and its effects on the population of the surrounding region were by any measure catastrophic. ash deposits from the eruption cover an area of roughly 10,000 square kilometers in Central America, to a depth sufficient to render the land agriculturally unusable for decades. The Maya cities of the southern lowlands show a pattern of population abandonment in the relevant period that corresponds in the sites where it has been most carefully studied to the ash layer Ilopango left behind. People did not die in the eruption itself, for the most part, or at least the death toll from the immediate event does not appear to have been the primary consequence. What the eruption did was remove the agricultural foundation from an enormous region all at once, forcing a migration of population that reshaped the demographic and political geography of Mesoamerica for centuries afterward. The refugees in their movement carried their culture, their agricultural knowledge, and their social organization northward into regions where those things took root in new forms. The disruption produced among its downstream consequences some of the conditions that allowed the great classic Maya cities of the northern lowlands to flourish. Catastrophe and cultural diffusion running together in the same event. The relationship between volcanic activity and human history is one of the areas where the evidence from multiple independent sources, ice cores, tree rings, lake, sediments, ancient texts, archaeological stratigraphy, has converged most productively in recent decades to produce a picture that is both more detailed and more unsettling than earlier generations of historians had available to them. The ice cores in particular have been revelatory. By drilling into the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica and analysing the sulfate deposits that volcanic eruptions leave at precisely datable depths in the annual ice layers, researchers have been able to construct a timeline of major volcanic events extending back thousands of years independently of any textual record. That timeline has then been compared with the archaeological and historical record of societal stress, population decline, and political instability in various regions, and the correlations that emerge are, in a number of cases, striking enough to have substantially revised older understandings of why certain civilizations collapsed when they did. The Late Bronze Age collapse, one of the great mysteries of ancient history, the simultaneous or near-simultaneous failure of almost every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 of the Before Common Era. A catastrophe so thorough that it ended the Mycenaean Greek world severely damaged. Egypt destroyed the Hittite Empire and reduced the great trading city of Ugarit to ruins that were never reoccupied, has been the subject of sustained scholarly debate for well over a century. Scholars still disagree, sometimes quite sharply, about whether the primary driver was climate change, volcanic activity, earthquake storms, the movements of the peoples referred to in Egyptian records as the Sea People's internal social collapse, or some combination of all of these arriving within a compressed window of time. No single explanation fully accounts for the breadth and simultaneity of the collapse, and the honest position which the most careful researchers maintain is that this was almost certainly a systemic failure in which multiple stresses interacted in ways that no individual stress in isolation would have been sufficient to produce. What the evidence does allow us to say with reasonable confidence is that the world of 1200 of the Before Common Era was a more interconnected and therefore a more systemically fragile world than it had been several centuries earlier. The palace economies of the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, and the Canaanite city-states were not self-sufficient. They were interdependent, trading grain, copper, tin, luxury goods, and administrative expertise across networks that spanned the eastern Mediterranean and extended into the broader Near East. When those networks were disrupted, whether by climate stress, reducing agricultural surpluses, by political instability, interrupting the movement of ships by military pressure from external populations, or by some combination of these, the individual nodes of the network lost the buffers that trade had provided, And without those buffers, the same harvest failure that a well-connected palace economy might have absorbed by importing from a neighbour became an existential crisis. The collapse, when it came quickly by the standards of Bronze Age history. Within the span of roughly 50 years, a world that had been producing some of the most sophisticated art architecture and administrative writing the ancient Mediterranean had yet seen was largely gone. The Linear B script, the earliest form of written Greek used by Mycenaean palace administrators to record the movement of goods and people through their redistributive economies, disappears from the record entirely. Not simplified, not replaced by something else in a continuous tradition, but gone. The practice of writing in the Aegean world vanishes for roughly 400 years, and then reappears when the Greeks adopt the Phoenician alphabet as something entirely different in form and function. 4 centuries of illiteracy in a civilization that had been literate. The fragility embedded in complexity made visible. There is a quieter category of geological event that belongs in this account, one that tends to receive less attention than earthquakes and volcanoes precisely because it operates so slowly and so silently that it rarely generates a dramatic historical moment. Coastal subsidence, the gradual sinking of land relative to sea level driven by tectonic processes, by the compaction of sediment or by the withdrawal of groundwater, has over the millennia of recorded history claimed an extraordinary number of ancient settlements that once stood on dry land. The harbour city of Alexandria in Egypt has lost a significant portion of its ancient waterfront to subsidence over the past 2,000 years, and underwater archaeological surveys have revealed temples, statues and entire neighbourhoods, now lying on the seafloor of the eastern harbour, descended so gradually that no ancient source records any moment of catastrophic inundation. The city simply sank incrementally over centuries, and the sea quietly took what the land gave up. The Earth, then, was not a passive stage for human history. It was a participant, active, variable, and operating on timescales that ranged from the instantaneous violence of an earthquake to the millennial patience of a coastline that sinks an inch per century until the harbour is gone. Ancient people navigated all of it with the tools and the knowledge they had, which were by any modern standard severely limited. They could not predict earthquakes. They could not model volcanic risk. They could not read the slow language of subsidence in the rock beneath their feet. What they could do, and what they did with a consistency that the archaeological record documents across every inhabited region of the ancient world, was persist in the face of it. Build again, plant again, move when moving was the only option, and stay when staying was still possible. But the Earth's violence, for all its scale, was at least impersonal. What human beings did to one another in the same centuries across the same landscapes is a different kind of accounting. And the evidence for it written in bone and fortification wall and mass grave is more extensive and more troubling than most of us have been taught to expect. Part 7. Violence in the ancient world did not require a state to organize it. Violence in. This is perhaps the most important corrective that the last several decades of archaeological research have offered to the older, more comfortable narrative about human prehistory. The narrative in which organized violence was essentially a product of civilization, an unfortunate byproduct of hierarchy and resource competition that emerged once people had cities and armies and rulers with ambitions larger than their territories. In that older narrative, the pre-state world was not peaceful exactly, but it was at least less systematically lethal. People lived in small groups. Conflicts were personal, limited, resolved by movement if not by negotiation. The machinery of mass violence had not yet been invented. The bones disagree. They disagree quietly, as bones do without argument or emphasis, simply by being what they are and showing what they show. And what they show across site after site, continent after continent, in deposits that predate the earliest cities by thousands of years, is a level of interpersonal and organized violence that does not fit the older story at all. The site of Crow Creek in what is now the state of South Dakota preserves one of the most studied examples of pre-state mass violence in the archaeological record of North America. Around the year 1325 of the Common Era, a fortified village on the Missouri River was attacked. The village had walls, a wooden palisade that had been rebuilt and reinforced at least once, suggesting that the people who lived there were accustomed to the need for defense. The attack overwhelmed those defenses. When archaeologists excavated the site in the 1970s, they found a mass grave containing the remains of nearly 500 individuals, men, women and children, whose bones showed evidence of perimortem processing, scalping decapitation, the removal of hands and feet, and in many cases the deliberate smashing of skulls. The bones had been gathered after the attack in a state of partial decomposition that suggests they lay exposed for some period before burial and interred in a single mass deposit that represents in the current population estimate for villages of that size and period something close to the entire community. What survives in the record suggests that virtually no one escaped. The scale of the violence relative to the size of the population it was directed against exceeds anything that most people associate with pre-state conflict. Crow Creek is not unique. It is one of the better documented examples of a phenomenon that appears across the archaeological record of North America, Europe, Asia, and the Pacific, with a frequency that has forced a substantial revision in how the field thinks about violence before the state. The site of Talheim in southwestern Germany, dating to roughly 5000 of the before Common Era, contains a pit burial of 34 individuals, men, women, and children, all killed by blows to the back of the skull, consistent with a population that was fleeing or restrained when they died. The site of Aspern-Schletz in Austria, roughly contemporary with Talheim, contains the remains of at least 67 individuals showing similar perimortem trauma, with the notable underrepresentation of young women in the skeletal assemblage that suggests they were taken rather than killed. The site of Widerstedt in central Germany adds another layer, a Neolithic massacre site where the long bones of the victims show cut marks consistent with defleshing in a pattern that some researchers interpret as evidence of cannibalism, though that interpretation remains debated and the evidence is not conclusive on its own. What these sites collectively suggest, and this is the picture that has emerged from a generation of careful forensic archaeology, not from any single dramatic discovery, is that the Neolithic period in Europe, the era of the first farming settlements, was marked by a level of inter-community violence that was by the measure of what proportion of the population died violently comparable to, or in some estimates exceeding the violence rates of the 20th century's worst conflicts. Steven Pinker's argument, developed at length in his work on the long-term decline of violence, draws heavily on this bioarchaeological data to make the case that pre-state societies were per capita more violent than modern ones. Other researchers contest both the data interpretation and the broader conclusion, arguing that the skeletal record is too fragmentary and too geographically uneven to support population-level violence rate estimates with any confidence, and that the sites that have been excavated represent a biased sample of the most dramatic events rather than a representative picture of ordinary life. This is a genuine scholarly dispute, not a settled question, and the honest position is that the evidence supports the existence of significant pre-state violence, while leaving the precise rates and the universality of the pattern genuinely uncertain. What is not disputed is that the fortifications were real. Across the Neolithic and early Bronze Age archaeological record of Europe and the Near East, the evidence for defensive architecture, ditched enclosures, palisaded walls, elaborately constructed gates designed to funnel and control entry, appears early, appears widely, and appears in forms whose engineering investment makes no sense unless the people who built them had a genuine and sustained need for the protection they provided. You do not spend months digging a ditch 3 meters deep around your village because you're worried about large predators. You do that because you're worried about other people. The weapons are equally informative. Arrowheads embedded in bone, axe wounds to the cranium whose shape and angle can be matched to the specific tool types of a given period and region. Copper and bronze daggers that appear in the archaeological record very shortly after copper and bronze themselves become available, suggesting that the metallurgical knowledge was applied to violence with a speed that reflects how immediately useful sharper weapons were recognized to be. There is a skeleton from the Iceman site in the Alps, the naturally mummified body known as Otzi, preserved in glacial ice for roughly 5,300 years and recovered in 1991, that has an arrowhead lodged in the left shoulder, positioned in a way that severed a major blood vessel. Otzi died of that wound likely within minutes or hours on a high alpine pass. He was based on the contents of his stomach and the wear patterns on his tools and equipment, a man in the middle of an ordinary journey. The arrow came from behind. He did not see it coming or could not avoid it. There is something in that image that the statistics cannot quite capture. The specificity of one person on arrow one ordinary day that ended without warning on a mountainside. And the statistics themselves, when you sit with them, are striking enough. The most comprehensive survey of skeletal trauma in pre-state populations drawing on data from sites across multiple continents and spanning the full range of the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods suggests that somewhere between 10 and 30% of adult male skeletons in pre-state populations show evidence of cranial trauma consistent with interpersonal violence. Not all of those injuries were fatal. Some show evidence of healing, meaning the person survived the blow, but the range even at the low end represents a background rate of violent injury that is by modern standards in stable societies extraordinary. The transition to state-organized societies did not eliminate violence. It transformed it, concentrating it in many cases into larger but less frequent events, and in other cases simply giving it a more elaborate organizational framework. The armies of the ancient civilizations brought a scale of killing that no pre-state raiding party could match. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in the year 9 of the Common Era, in which 3 Roman legions were ambushed and destroyed in the forests of northwestern Germany, left somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 Roman soldiers dead within the space of 3 days. The Battle of Cannae, fought between Rome and Carthage in the year 216 of the before Common Era, killed somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 men in a single afternoon, a death rate per hour that exceeds almost any engagement in recorded military history before the Industrial Era. The Mongolian campaigns of the 13th century killed, by the most careful modern estimates, somewhere between 30 and 40 million people across Eurasia, over the course of several decades, reducing the population of some regions, the Iranian plateau, northern China, the Kievan Rus, by fractions that took centuries to recover. These numbers are not offered as a catalogue of horrors. They are offered because they are part of the honest accounting of what the ancient world was. The violence was real, and it was pervasive from the Neolithic village, defended by its ditch, to the great set-piece battles of classical antiquity, to the systematic devastation of the Mongol conquests. It operated at every scale, from the single arrow in the back on an alpine pass to the organized annihilation of entire cities. And it interacted with everything else in this story, with the disease burden that weakened populations before armies arrived, with the famine that followed the destruction of agricultural infrastructure, with the climate stress that drove migration and competition for arable land in the first place. The question that remains, and that deserves its own careful treatment, is how we know any of this with the confidence we claim to know it. Because the evidence for all of it, for the violence, for the disease, for the famine, for the geological catastrophes, comes to us through the imperfect filter of what survives. And what survives and what it can and cannot tell us is a more complicated matter than it might appear from a distance. The bones, the pollen cores, the ice layers, the ancient texts, each of them is a fragment of a picture that was never complete to begin with. Reading them requires not just scientific skill, but a particular kind of intellectual honesty about the limits of what the record can support. That is where the story turns next. Not to more events, but to the evidence itself, to what the physical and documentary record actually shows and where it goes quiet and what that silence means. Every claim in this story rests on something. A layer of sediment, a fragment of bone, a column of ice drilled from a glacier that has been accumulating snowfall season by season for the past 100,000 years. A tooth, a text written by someone who was there, or who claimed to be, or who was recording what someone else had told them 3 generations after the event. The evidence is real, and it is genuinely remarkable in what it allows us to reconstruct. But it is also incomplete in ways that matter, and understanding how we know what we know, and where the knowing runs out, is not a footnote to the history, it is part of the history itself. Take the ice cores first, because they are among the most quietly extraordinary scientific instruments that the study of the ancient world has produced. When snow falls on the Greenland ice sheet or on the Antarctic plateau, it compresses over time into ice trapping within it, tiny bubbles of the atmosphere that existed at the moment of its formation. Year by year the layers accumulate, and the ice that results is a physical archive of the past, of ancient air, of ancient temperature, of the volcanic sulfate deposits that major eruptions inject into the stratosphere, and that fall out of the atmosphere over the following months and years as a thin datable layer in the annual ice record. Drilling into that archive and reading it requires extraordinary precision. The annual layers near the surface of the core are thick and easy to distinguish, but at depth where the ice has been compressed by the weight of everything above it, a single year's accumulation may be less than a millimetre, and counting the layers accurately across a core that spans 100,000 years demands a combination of chemical analysis, visual inspection, and cross-referencing between multiple cores drilled at different locations to confirm that what looks like an anomaly in one record appears in others as well. What the ice cores have given historians and climate scientists when read carefully against the documentary and archaeological record is a timeline of atmospheric events, volcanic eruptions, episodes of elevated dust periods of the unusual temperature, that is independent of anything any ancient person wrote down. That independence is its great value. When the sulfate spike in the Greenland ice at a depth corresponding to the mid-6th century of the Common Era matches the descriptions of a dimmed sun in Byzantine Chinese and Irish chronicles, the convergence of 2 entirely separate lines of evidence strengthens the case in a way that neither source could achieve alone. The ice does not know about Procopius. Procopius did not know about ice cores. When they agree, there is a reason to trust that something real is being described. The limitation, and it is a real one, is in the precision of the dating. Ice core chronologies are constructed by counting annual layers, and the further back in time the core reaches, the greater the accumulated uncertainty in those layer counts. A dating uncertainty of plus or minus a few years in a core covering 100,000 years of history is by any technical standard a remarkable achievement. But a few years in the context of trying to match a volcanic eruption to a specific political collapse or a specific famine year recorded in a chronicle can be the difference between a compelling causal argument and an interesting coincidence. Scholars working at the intersection of climate science and ancient history are careful, or should be careful, about this, and the best work in the field presents its correlations with explicit acknowledgement of the chronological uncertainty Rather than papering over it with confident causal language, the tree ring record operates on a different principle and offers a different kind of precision. Trees in temperate climates grow a new ring of wood each year, and the width and density of each ring reflects the growing conditions of that specific year, the temperature, the rainfall, the length of the frost-free season. A wide, dense ring speaks to good year. A narrow, faint ring speaks to cold drought or some other stress. By overlapping ring sequences from living trees with sequences from ancient timber preserved in archaeological sites, researchers have constructed continuous tree ring chronologies, dendrochronological records, that extend back several thousand years in some regions, and that provide a year-by-year register of climatic conditions with a temporal precision that ice cores cannot match. The record for Central Europe, built from preserved oak timber, found in archaeological contexts ranging from Roman buildings to Bronze Age pile dwellings, extends back more than 12,000 years in some reconstructions. What the tree rings from the mid-6th century show is unambiguous and consistent across sites from Scandinavia to Siberia to North America. The years 536, 540 and 541 produce some of the narrowest, most stressed growth rings of the entire Common Era. In some sequences, the rings from those years are so thin as to be nearly invisible to the naked eye. A forest-wide record of seasons so cold and so dark that the trees barely grew. That record cross-referenced with the ice core sulfate data and the documentary sources forms the evidentiary foundation for what climatologist Michael McCormick and his colleagues have called in their published research the beginning of the worst period to be alive in the Northern Hemisphere in the last 2,300 years. A striking claim, and one that the evidence, when assessed with appropriate care, does support, though the full picture remains the subject of active research and ongoing revision as new cores are drilled and new archaeological sites are excavated. The human skeletal record introduces a different set of possibilities and a different set of limitations. Bone is durable in a way that soft tissue is not, which means that the skeleton can survive for thousands of years in the right burial conditions and yield to a trained forensic eye an extraordinary range of information about the life of the person it belonged to. But bone is also silent on a great deal. It records the diseases that affect skeletal tissue directly. Tuberculosis, which leaves characteristic lesions on the vertebrae. Treponematosis, which produces distinctive changes in the long bones. Certain fungal infections that mark the skull. It records traumatic injury with a clarity that is, in cases of well-preserved specimens, almost forensic in its detail. It records nutritional stress through the Harris lines and enamel defects already described. What it cannot record or cannot record reliably is the vast range of soft tissue diseases, the respiratory infections, the gastrointestinal illnesses, the fevers, the parasitic conditions that never touch bone, that were in the ancient world responsible for a substantial portion of mortality. The skeleton tells a partial story. It tells it honestly, but partial is what it is. Ancient genomics has expanded the range of what bone can say in ways that were not imaginable a generation ago. By extracting and sequencing ancient deoxyribonucleic acid from the teeth and bones of people who died hundreds or thousands of years ago, researchers can now detect the presence of specific pathogens in ancient populations, identify the precise bacterial strain responsible for a medieval plague burial, trace the geographic origin of a disease outbreak through the genetic signature of the pathogen itself, and reconstruct the immune history of ancient populations by reading the selection pressures that past diseases have left in the human genome. The recovery of Yersinia pestis deoxyribonucleic acid from Bronze Age burial sites in Central Asia at dates several thousand years before the Justinianic plague has pushed the known history of that bacterium substantially further back than the documentary record alone would suggest, and raised new questions about what earlier, undocumented encounters between human populations and plague might have looked like. The evidence for those earlier encounters is tantalizing but incomplete, and the field is moving quickly enough that interpretations that seemed settled a few years ago are being revised as new data comes in from new sites. The documentary sources present their own layered complexity. Ancient historians wrote for audiences and purposes that were not primarily archival. They made choices about what to record and what to omit, choices shaped by the political and cultural frameworks of their own time and place, by the genres and conventions of historical writing available to them, by what their patrons wanted to hear and what their readers expected to find. Thucydides, writing in the 5th century of the Before Common Era about the plague that struck Athens during the Peloponnesian War, gives a clinical description of symptoms that has been analysed by medical historians for over 2,000 years in an attempt to identify the causative organism. The description is detailed and apparently careful. Thucydides states that he contracted the disease himself and survived it, but it does not map cleanly onto any single modern diagnosis. Proposals have included typhoid fever, Ebola-like hemorrhagic fever, toxic shock syndrome, and a combination of multiple simultaneous infections. The most recent ancient genomic analysis of skeletal material from a burial site associated with the Athenian plague detected the presence of Salmonella typhi, supporting the typhoid hypothesis. But the sample size was small, and other researchers have questioned whether the association is secure. Scholars still debate what killed Athens in 430 of the Before Common Era, and the honest answer is that the question may never be definitively resolved. That particular kind of irresolution is worth sitting with, rather than moving past too quickly, because it is characteristic of the ancient record as a whole. The evidence we have is real, and it is genuinely informative. The picture it builds across ice cores and tree rings and ancient bone and genomic data, and the imperfect testimony of ancient writers is coherent enough that its broad outlines can be stated with confidence. The ancient world was dangerous, the bodies were fragile, the climate was variable and sometimes catastrophic. The violence was more prevalent and more organized than older narratives allowed. These things are as well established as anything in the study of the ancient past. What the evidence does not give us, and what intellectual honesty requires acknowledging, is certainty about causes and mechanisms at the level of individual events. Why the late Bronze Age collapsed when it did, and not a generation earlier or later. What precise combination of factors tipped the Justinianic plague from a terrible epidemic into a 2-century pandemic? Why some populations exposed to the same climatic stress survived it and others did not? The evidence points. It illuminates. In a number of cases, it dramatically revises older understandings. But the ancient world was complex in ways that no surviving record fully captures, and the gaps in that record are themselves evidence of how much was lost. What is not lost, and what the record does preserve across every source and every method, is the human response to all of it. The adaptation, the rebuilding, the refusal repeated across every century and every catastrophe to simply stop. That response is the part of the story the evidence is in the end most eloquent about, and it deserves its own careful examination. Part 9. Among historians of the ancient world, there is a disagreement that has been running in various forms for well over a century, and it concerns something that sounds almost philosophical when stated plainly. How dangerous was the past really, and for whom? And compared to what? The question matters because the answer shapes everything. It shapes how we understand the relationship between civilization and suffering, between progress and cost, between the world our ancestors inhabited and the one we have built in the time since. and it is not a question with a single settled answer, despite the confidence with which various positions are sometimes asserted. The scholars who have spent their careers closest to the evidence tend on the whole to be the most careful about overclaiming. The broad outlines of the story told in this video, the fragile body, the variable climate, the pervasive disease burden, the significant pre-state violence, are as well supported as anything the study of deep history offers. But within those outlines there is genuine and productive disagreement about mechanisms, magnitudes and meaning that deserves its own honest treatment. One of the most significant fault lines in the field runs between two different ways of reading the violence data. On one side are researchers who look at the bioarchaeological record, the skeletal trauma rates, the mass grave sites, the fortification evidence, and conclude that pre-state and early state societies were by any reasonable per capita measure more violent than the modern world, at least in the developed nations where violence has declined most dramatically over the past several centuries. The argument draws on a wide evidentiary base and has been made with considerable analytical rigour. On the other side are researchers who argue that this reading commits a fundamental methodological error. It compares the worst documented moments of prehistoric violence, the massacre sites, the battle cemeteries, against the average conditions of modern life, rather than against the worst moments of modern violence, or the average conditions of prehistoric life. A mass grave from Neolithic Europe represents one event preserved by accident in a landscape of millions of people across thousands of years. It cannot tell us what the average person's risk of dying violently was in that period, any more than a photograph of a battlefield tells us what the average day in a soldier's life looked like. Both positions have merit. The evidence for significant pre-state violence is real and should not be minimized. The methodological cautions about inferring population-level rates from a necessarily incomplete and event-biased sample are also legitimate and should not be dismissed. The honest resolution is probably something like this. Pre-state violence was more prevalent, more organizationally sophisticated and more lethal per event than older peaceful primitive narratives suggested, but reconstructing precise per capita violence rates from the available evidence involves assumptions that the evidence cannot fully support, and claims made with great confidence in either direction outrun what the data actually shows. Scholars still debate not just the interpretation of specific sites, but the entire methodological framework for comparing violence rates across populations separated by thousands of years and radically different social arrangements. A different and perhaps more practically consequential debate concerns the question of how much of ancient mortality was inevitable and how much was contingent, shaped not by the unavoidable limits of pre-modern knowledge and technology, but by specific social, political, and economic arrangements that different societies organized differently, with measurably different outcomes. This is at its heart a debate about agency. Did ancient people die young and hard because the world was simply that dangerous, and no arrangement of human society could have done much about it? Or were their paths not taken, systems not built, distributions of resources not made, that would have substantially reduced the death toll even within the constraints of pre-modern knowledge? The evidence suggests with a consistency that crosses multiple periods and multiple regions that the second answer carries more weight than a simple technological determinist view would allow. Societies that invested in water management, in aqueducts, in drainage, in the separation of drinking water from waste, had measurably lower rates of waterborne disease mortality than those that did not, even when operating at comparable levels of medical understanding and agricultural technology. Societies that maintained large diversified grain stores and distribution systems, the Egyptian state granaries, the Roman Annona, the Song dynasty's ever-normal granaries in China which bought surplus grain in good years and sold it below market price in bad ones, absorbed harvest failures with substantially less mortality than societies without comparable buffer systems. Societies with strong horizontal social networks, dense webs of mutual obligation and resource sharing at the community level, showed greater resilience to crisis events than more hierarchical societies in which surplus was concentrated at the top and the lower levels of the social order had no claim on it in times of shortage. None of this is simple, and researchers who work in this area are careful about the limits of comparison across radically different social contexts. But the implication is real. Some of the danger of the ancient world was structural, built into the specific ways that specific societies chose or were arranged to organize themselves, and not simply the universal condition of life before modern medicine. The suffering was not all inevitable. Some of it was made. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable finding in the entire literature, because it extends the accounting backward in time in a way that purely technological explanations do not. If the danger was partly structural, then the question of who benefited from the structures that produced it, who held the surplus grain, who built the walls that protected the city's centre, while leaving the outer settlements exposed, who organized the labor that constructed the aqueducts they themselves would drink from, becomes a question about history that is not entirely separate from questions about the present. Historians are generally cautious about drawing direct lines from ancient social arrangements to modern ones. The caution is warranted. But the basic observation that inequality in access to resources in pre-modern, as in modern societies, translated with quiet directness into inequality and survival, is supported by the evidence across enough independent contexts to be stated with confidence. A third area of genuine scholarly debate, and one that has become considerably more active in recent years as ancient genomic data has accumulated, concerns the role of migration in the spread of both disease and violence across the ancient world. The older model dominant for much of the 20th century tended to explain the cultural changes visible in the archaeological record, the appearance of new pottery styles, new burial practices, new metallurgical traditions, primarily through the diffusion of ideas rather than the movement of people. Trade imitation. The gradual spread of innovation across stable populations. The ancient genomic data has substantially complicated this picture. The analysis of ancient deoxyribonucleic acid from burial sites across Europe and Asia has revealed that some of the most dramatic cultural transitions in prehistoric Europe were accompanied by population replacements that were, in genetic terms, remarkably thorough. Not gradual cultural diffusion, but the arrival of new people in numbers large enough to substantially alter the genetic composition of the regions they entered. The Yamnaya expansion, which brought steppe pastoralists from the region north of the Black Sea into Central and Western Europe around 5,000 years ago, is the most studied example. The genetic data shows that within a few generations of the Yamnaya arrival, the genetic ancestry of populations across a broad swath of Europe had shifted dramatically towards steppe-derived ancestry at the expense of the Neolithic farmers who had preceded them. What this transition looked like on the ground, whether it was primarily violent displacement, competitive demographic replacement through higher reproductive rates, the differential survival of populations with different disease resistances, or some combination of these, is debated with considerable intensity among researchers who interpret the same genetic data through different historical frameworks. The genomic signal of replacement is clear. The social mechanism that produced it is not. What the ancient genomic data has also revealed, and this is among the more striking findings of the last decade, is that the expansion of steppe ancestry into Europe appears to have been accompanied by the introduction of Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, into European populations that had not previously encountered it. ancient plague genomes have been recovered from burial sites associated with the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age of Europe at dates preceding the Justinianic plague by more than 2,000 years, suggesting that plague was moving through European populations during or shortly after the Yamnaya expansion. Whether this early plague was transmitted the same way as the medieval plague, through flea bites on rats, the classic bubonic transmission route, or through respiratory transmission, or through direct contact is not yet established. The genomic variants associated with flea-borne transmission appear to have developed later. The early strains may have been primarily pneumonic, spreading person to person through the air, which would mean a different epidemiology and potentially a different demographic impact than the flea-transmitted plague that devastated medieval Europe. The evidence points in interesting directions. The picture is not yet complete. What all of these debates share beneath their specific empirical disagreements is a common recognition that the ancient world was not a simple place, and that the forces that made it dangerous did not operate independently of one another. The climate shaped the agricultural surplus or its absence. The surplus or its absence shaped the nutritional status of the population. The nutritional status shaped the immune response to pathogens. The pathogens moved along the same routes as trade and migration. The migration brought new populations with new genetic resistances and new disease exposures into contact with populations that had neither. Violence competed with disease and famine for the available mortality, and in the worst periods they worked together, each one lowering the resistance of bodies and communities to the next. The story is braided, not linear, and the scholarly disagreements that run through it are not signs of a discipline that has failed to reach the truth. They are signs of a discipline that is still doing the hard, careful work of finding it. What has been found and what can be stated with genuine confidence, despite all the legitimate uncertainty at the margins, is that the people who lived in this world were real, and they suffered real things, and they also, generation after generation in every region and every period of India, found ways to continue. What those ways were and what they built and passed forward is the part of the story that remains to be told. Part 10. Survival in the ancient world was never a passive condition. It was not something that happened to people while they went about their lives. It was the thing they were doing continuously, collectively, in ways that were so deeply woven into the fabric of daily existence that they rarely announced themselves as survival strategies at all. They looked like customs, like religious practices, like the particular way a community organized its planting calendar or stored its grain or managed its relationships with neighboring groups, or raised its children to understand which plants near the river were safe to eat and which ones were not. The accumulated wisdom of survival was not written down for most of human history. It was lived. It was transmitted through imitation and instruction, and the slow pressure of consequences on behavior over generations too numerous to count. The first and perhaps most fundamental of these strategies was social. Human beings are, in the technical language of evolutionary biology, an obligately social species, meaning that individual humans separated from the group have a survival profile that is genuinely poor. The lone hunter-gatherer, the isolated farmer, the solitary family unit without access to a wider network of mutual obligation was a vulnerable entity in a way that a well-integrated community member was not. This is not a romanticization of ancient communal life, which was by all accounts constrained and hierarchical, and often deeply unequal in ways that fell along lines of gender and age and status, that benefited some members considerably more than others. It is simply a recognition of what the evidence shows, that the communities which survived the worst events in the ancient record were with notable consistency the ones with the strongest internal networks of resource sharing, the most robust systems of mutual obligation and the greatest capacity to coordinate collective action under stress. The archaeology of crisis response reveals this with a clarity that is, once you know, to look for it visible in the material record. Settlements that survived the climate disruptions of the late third millennium of the before Common Era, the period of the 4.2 kilo-year event, tend to show in the archaeological record of the following centuries evidence of increased investment in communal storage facilities, larger granaries, more elaborate water management systems, physical infrastructure that represents a collective decision to pool and manage resources rather than leaving each household to manage its own. The crisis, in other words, produced not only death, but institutional learning. The communities that survived it were in many cases different communities afterward, more organized, more collectively oriented, more capable of buffering the next disruption because the last one had demonstrated with the kind of clarity that only genuine catastrophe provides what the cost of insufficient preparation was. The role of religion in ancient survival deserves attention here because it tends to be treated in popular history either as a source of irrational behavior, the sacrifice made to stop a plague, the prayer offered to a god who does not respond, or as a purely epiphenomenal feature of culture, a gloss on top of the real economic and social mechanisms that actually determined outcomes. Neither treatment does justice to what the evidence suggests. Religious institutions in the ancient world were, among other things, redistribution systems. Temples in Mesopotamia and Egypt and the ancient Near East functioned as granaries, as banks, as centers for the organization of agricultural labor, as networks through which surplus in one community could be transferred to deficit in another. The religious obligation to feed the poor, which appears in one form or another in virtually every major ancient religious tradition, was not merely a moral aspiration. It was a mechanism for moving resources through a social network in ways that reduced the lethality of localized shortfalls. The theological framework that surrounded this redistribution, the idea that generosity was commanded by divine authority, that failure to share brought supernatural consequences, was whatever else it was an effective enforcement mechanism for behavior that the community's collective survival required. This is not a cynical reading of religion as merely functional. The people who built and maintained these institutions were not, in most cases, consciously engineering survival systems. They were doing what their faith required of them within frameworks of meaning that were real and deeply held. The point is simply that the functional and the meaningful were not in conflict in these systems. They were the same thing seen from different angles. Water management stands as one of the clearest examples of collective investment in survival across the ancient world, and its history is more intricate and more impressive than it tends to appear in summary accounts. The Qanat system of ancient Persia, a network of underground channels that transported water from mountain aquifers to lowland agricultural settlements through gravity-fed tunnels that could run for tens of kilometers beneath the surface, represents an engineering achievement of the first order, one that allowed large populations to inhabit regions that would otherwise have been uninhabitable for most of the year. The Qanats were constructed and maintained collectively distributed water according to systems of customary right that were adjudicated by community institutions and required continuous labor investment to remain functional. They also made entire civilizations possible in landscapes that annual rainfall alone could never have supported. The knowledge required to survey a Qanat route, to identify the precise gradient that would maintain water flow across tens of kilometers of underground tunnel, was technical knowledge of a high order accumulated over generations and passed down through specialist lineages whose work was as consequential for the survival of their communities as the work of any soldier or priest. The management of epidemic disease in the absence of any understanding of its microbial causes is perhaps the most striking example of effective survival behavior operating through entirely non-mechanistic frameworks. Ancient societies across multiple cultures developed practices of isolation and quarantine for the visibly ill that were by modern epidemiological standards functionally correct, even though the explanatory framework that surrounded them was entirely wrong. The Mosaic Law's requirements for the isolation of individuals showing signs of skin disease, the Athenian practice of removing the sick from the city during plague years, the medieval institution of the lazaretto, the quarantine station maintained at port cities to hold incoming ships and their crews for observation before allowing them to land, all of these represent practical measures that reduce transmission in ways that the people implementing them could not have explained in terms of pathogens and incubation periods because those concepts did not yet exist. They worked anyway. Not perfectly, no pre-modern quarantine system was sufficiently rigorous or consistently enforced to stop a major epidemic, but well enough to matter at the margins where in the mathematics of epidemic spread marginal reductions in transmission rate translate into meaningful reductions in total mortality. There is a detail from the Black Death period that sits in this category of quietly effective improvised response, and that is not widely known outside the specialist literature. In several communities in medieval Europe, the response to epidemic mortality included the rapid expansion of hospital facilities, not in the modern sense of medically equipped treatment centres, but in the original sense of the word places of hospitality, where the sick could be housed, fed and cared for by attendants who had in many cases survived earlier waves of the disease and developed some degree of acquired immunity. The Venetian system of public health administration, which had developed by the mid-14th century in response to repeated plague outbreaks, and which included paid public health officials, mandatory reporting of deaths and organised burial procedures, represents one of the earliest examples of anything resembling a state public health infrastructure in the Western world. It emerged not from any theoretical understanding of disease transmission, but from the hard-won practical learning of a city that had endured multiple catastrophic outbreaks and decided collectively that something systematic needed to be done about it. The evidence remains incomplete about how much mortality this system prevented, and the estimates that have been proposed vary considerably, but the institutional innovation was real, and it established precedents that influenced public health organisation across Europe for the following centuries. The biological dimension of human survival in the ancient world runs parallel to all of these social and institutional strategies, and it is in its own way just as remarkable. The human immune system is not a fixed architecture. It is a learning system, one that maintains across a lifetime a library of immunological memory built from every pathogen it has successfully fought off, and that can in some cases confer protection against related organisms it has never encountered based on structural similarities to ones it has. The immunological diversity of human populations, which is driven in large part by the extraordinary variability of the major histocompatibility complex genes that govern immune recognition, means that in any population exposed to a novel pathogen, some individuals will mount more effective responses than others, survive when others do not, and pass on to their children immune architectures that are in that specific pathogen environment, better suited to survival. This is evolution operating in real time, visible in the genetic record as selection sweeps. Regions of the genome where a beneficial variant has spread rapidly through a population under strong selective pressure. The genetic signatures of past pandemics are in this sense still present in the human genome today. Variants that confer resistance to specific pathogens appear at elevated frequencies in the descendants of populations that experienced high mortality from those pathogens, and at lower frequencies in populations that were not exposed. The elevated frequency of certain variants associated with plague resistance in European populations compared to populations from regions where plague was historically less prevalent reflects the selective pressure of centuries of plague exposure written into the deoxyribonucleic acid of the survivors' descendants. The ancient disease left a mark on the genome that persists thousands of years after the last case was recorded. The bodies of modern Europeans carry in their immune architecture the residue of the Justinianic plague and the Black Death, a biological inheritance from ancestors who survived something that killed a substantial fraction of everyone around them. What is perhaps most worth understanding about human survival in the ancient world is not any single strategy or any single biological advantage. It is the combination, the layering of social network upon institutional infrastructure, upon accumulated practical knowledge, upon biological resilience, upon sheer unchosen luck, that produced the outcomes the record shows. No one of these factors was sufficient on its own. People with strong immune systems died in famines. People with full granaries died in earthquakes. People in well-organized communities with robust redistribution systems died in pandemics that overwhelmed every social buffer. Survival was never guaranteed by any single variable, and the ancient world did not operate according to the logic of a system that rewarded the prepared and spared the unlucky. It was messier than that and more contingent and sometimes more brutal and sometimes quietly, mysteriously more merciful than the odds would seem to allow. What that survival left behind in the landscape, in the culture and the architecture of the modern world and the modern body is a legacy that runs deeper than most of us realize. And tracing it gently from the ancient past to the present is where this story goes next. Part 11. The past is not as distant as it appears from here. This is not a metaphor, or not only a metaphor. It is a statement about biology, about architecture, about the specific ways that everything described in this video left marks on the world that are still visible, still measurable, still shaping the conditions of the present in ways that most of us move through without noticing. The ancient world did not end. It transformed. It deposited itself into the landscape and the genome and the cultural memory of every civilization that came after it. And those deposits are for researchers who know how to read them among the richest sources of evidence we have for understanding both what the past was and what the present is. Begin with the body, because the body is the most intimate inheritance. The human immune system, as described in the previous part of this story, carries within it the accumulated memory of every major pathogen encounter that the ancestors of a given population survived. But the immune legacy of the ancient world runs deeper than specific pathogen resistance. It runs into the basic architecture of how the immune system is calibrated, the threshold at which it recognizes a foreign substance and mounts a response, the intensity of that response, the degree to which it distinguishes between genuine threats and harmless environmental antigens, and that calibration, it turns out, reflects the microbial environment of the ancient world in ways that have significant consequences for the health of people living in the modern one. The hygiene hypothesis, a term that has become somewhat misleading in its popular usage, but that points at a real and well-documented phenomenon, proposes that the dramatic increase in autoimmune and allergic conditions in industrialized populations over the last century is partly a consequence of the immune system being calibrated over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution to operate in an environment far more microbially rich than the one modern sanitation and medicine have produced. The ancient gut was colonized from birth by a diverse community of bacteria, parasites, and other microorganisms that the immune system learned to tolerate, and that learning process appears to have been important for setting the threshold at which the immune system distinguishes between threats worth attacking and things worth leaving alone. In an environment where that early microbial education does not occur, where the infant gut is never exposed to the full complement of organisms, it was evolutionarily shaped to encounter. The immune system's calibration is different, and the consequences show up as a heightened rate of conditions in which the immune system shock attacks the body's own tissues or overreacts to harmless substances. The ancient disease burden, in other words, was not only a cause of death, it was also a teacher. And the removal of the teacher has had consequences that researchers are still working to fully characterize. The genetic legacy of specific ancient catastrophes is traceable with increasing precision as ancient genomic datasets grow larger and the analytical tools for interrogating them become more sophisticated. One of the more striking recent findings concerns the genetic aftermath of the Black Death, the 14th century plague that killed somewhere between a third and a half of the population of Europe within the span of a few years. Researchers analysing ancient deoxyribonucleic acid from burial sites associated with pre-plague and post-plague European populations have found evidence that the plague exerted measurable selective pressure on immune-related genes, that the people who survived the Black Death were not simply lucky, but were as a group somewhat differently equipped immunologically than the people who died, and that those differences are detectable in the genomes of modern European populations as a subtle but statistically significant shift in the frequency of certain immune gene variants. The plague, in other words, did not just reduce the European population by a third, it changed the genetic composition of the population that remained in ways that persist to this day. The evidence for the specific variants under selection is still being refined, and some of the early findings have been subject to revision as larger datasets have become available. But the broad principle that a pandemic severe enough to kill a substantial fraction of a population will leave a detectable genetic signature in the survivors' descendants is now well established. The stress response system offers another line of inheritance that connects the ancient world to the modern body in ways that are both fascinating and, for the people in whom they operate, sometimes difficult. The physiological mechanisms of the acute stress response, the release of cortisol and adrenaline, the acceleration of heart rate, the sharpening of sensory attention, the temporary suppression of immune and digestive function in favor of immediate physical readiness, evolved in an environment where the primary threats were immediate physical and resolved quickly one way or another. A predator and enemy, a physical danger that either killed you or did not within minutes. The response is exquisitely calibrated for that kind of threat. It is considerably less well suited to the chronic, low-grade, psychologically complex stresses of modern life. The sustained uncertainty, the social threat, the unresolvable anxiety, because those threat types were not the primary selection pressures that shaped it. The mismatch between an ancient stress response system and a modern threat environment is not a dysfunction. It is a design feature of a machine built for a different world still running in this one doing its best. The landscape carries its own layer of ancient inheritance. The road network of modern Europe follows in its broad structure routes that were first established by Roman military and administrative needs nearly 2,000 years ago, and in many cases follows them because those routes reflected genuine geographic logic. The passes through the Alps, the fords across rivers, the flat corridors through otherwise difficult terrain, that has not changed. The City of London exists where it exists because the Romans chose that particular bend in the Thames as a crossing and administrative centre in the 1st century of the Common Era, and the 2,000 years of subsequent development have been built layer by layer on top of that original decision. When workers excavating for new construction in the City of London encounter Roman foundations beneath the medieval ones, beneath the early modern ones, they are reading a stratigraphy of continuous habitation that reflects the simple, persistent logic of a good location chosen once and never abandoned. Water infrastructure tells a version of the same story at even greater depth. The Qanat systems of Iran and Afghanistan, which were described earlier in this account as products of ancient Persian engineering, are not museum pieces. A significant number of them are still functioning. still moving water from mountain aquifers to lowland fields through gravity-fed underground channels, still maintained by communities that have inherited both the physical infrastructure and the knowledge required to keep it operational across generations separated from the original builders by 2,500 years. The oldest continuously functioning human engineering in the world is not a pyramid or a palace. It is a water channel dug in the ground, tended by people who understand that their survival depends on keeping it open. The ancient infrastructure of survival is in places still the infrastructure of survival. The cultural inheritance of the ancient world's encounter with mortality is perhaps the most pervasive and the hardest to measure with precision. The specific ways that different cultures organize their relationships with death, the mourning practices, the burial customs, the religious frameworks for understanding what death means and what, if anything, follows it, reflect in forms that are often deeply transformed and sometimes barely recognizable the accumulated weight of living in close proximity to death for most of human history. The elaborateness of medieval European funerary culture, with its masses for the dead and its chantry chapels and its entire institutional infrastructure for managing the relationship between the living and those they had lost, makes a different kind of sense when understood as the product of a society in which nearly everyone had lost multiple children, multiple parents, multiple siblings, multiple friends to causes that were neither preventable nor explicable in any framework that offered genuine understanding. The rituals were not irrational. They were a technology for managing grief at a scale that the modern world, for all its losses, does not routinely encounter. The specific fear of plague, distinct from the general fear of illness, focused on the particular combination of sudden onset visible bodily change and near certain death that bubonic plague produced at its worst, left traces in European cultural memory that persisted for centuries after the last major outbreak. The danse macabre tradition in medieval and early modern art, which depicted death as a figure who came for everyone regardless of status or preparation, is usually read as memento mori, a reminder of mortality. It is also, at a more immediate level, a document of what it felt like to live in a world where plague could arrive without warning and kill a third of your neighbours before winter. The art was not being dramatic. It was being accurate. There is a detail from the post-plague landscape of 14th century Europe that sits at the intersection of demography, economics, and cultural transformation in a way that is worth pausing over. The massive population loss of the Black Death, a loss so large that some regions did not recover their pre-plague population levels for a century and a half, produced among its many downstream consequences a labour shortage so acute and so prolonged that it substantially altered the bargaining position of agricultural workers relative to landowners across much of northern and western Europe. Fewer workers meant higher wages for those who survived. Higher wages meant greater economic autonomy for a class of people who had previously had very little. The social disruption of the plague years contributed through mechanisms that historians continue to debate in their specifics to the conditions that made the peasant revolts of the late 14th century possible. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the French Jacquerie of 1358 and their equivalents across the continent, and to the longer-term erosion of the feudal labour arrangements that the plague's demographic consequences had made economically unworkable. The plague killed people in enormous numbers, and in doing so it changed the power relations of an entire civilization in ways that filtered forward into the economic and social structures of the following centuries. Whether those changes were on balance progress, whether the suffering that produced them could be understood as having served some larger purpose, is a question that historians approach with caution, and that does not have a clean answer. The changes were real, the cost was real, the connection between them was real. What to make of that connection is a harder question. The modern world was built by people who survived the ancient one, not metaphorically, but literally, who inherited bodies shaped by its selection pressures, who walked roads laid along its roots, who organized their communities around institutions whose deep roots reach back into the survival strategies of populations facing threats that most of us will never personally encounter. We carry that world with us invisibly in our genes and our cities and our social instincts and our particular ways of responding to danger and loss and uncertainty. It is closer than it looks. And what it all amounts to, the full weight of everything described across this long account, is a question that deserves to be held quietly without rush in the dark. Part 12. What remains after everything is a question of proportion. Not proportion in the mathematical sense, not the ratio of deaths to survivors is, or the fraction of civilizations that collapsed against the fraction that persisted, though those ratios are real, and the arithmetic of them is sobering enough on its own. Proportion in the older sense. The sense that asks, given everything this story has described, given the full weight of what it meant to be alive in the world before the last 2 centuries gradually, imperfectly, and still incompletely began to change the terms of human survival. Given all of that, what is the honest way to hold it? What posture does the evidence actually support when you sit with it long enough to let it settle? This video has moved through a great deal of ground. It began with the planet itself, with the geological and atmospheric conditions that shaped the stage on which all human experience played out the volcanic winters and the mega droughts and the slow subsidence of coastlines that no one recorded because no single generation could perceive it happening. It moved through the body, the fragile, remarkable, disease-exposed body that ancient people carried through lives measured in decades rather than centuries, marked by the accumulated trauma of injury and infection and nutritional deprivation that the skeleton records with quiet, impartial honesty. It traced the great epidemic events, the Antonine Plague, the Justinianic Plague, the Black Death, not as isolated catastrophes, but as expressions of a deeper structural vulnerability that settlement and density, and the movement of people and goods along trade routes had built into the fabric of civilized life. It sat with the evidence for violence which was more pervasive and more organized than older narratives allowed, and with the evidence for famine, which was not an interruption of normal life, but a recurring feature of it woven into the agricultural calendar with the grim regularity of seasons. It examined what we know and how we know it and where the knowing runs out. It traced the strategies, social, institutional, biological, cultural, through which human beings navigated conditions that should by any modern calculation have been unsurvivable for more of them than they were. And then it arrived here at the question of what all of that left behind. What the ancient world deposited into the present invisibly in the genome and the road network and the immune system and the deep grammar of how human societies organize themselves in the face of danger. The answer across every line of evidence is the same more than we realize and more continuously than we notice. There is a particular detail that has stayed with me across the long arc of this story, and it seems worth naming now near the end because it crystallizes something that the larger account can sometimes obscure through its own scale. It comes from the archaeology of the post-plague landscape of 14th century England, from the villages that were abandoned during and after the Black Death, and that were never resettled, leaving their earthwork remains visible in the English countryside as low grassed-over ridges and hollows that aerial photography has catalogued in the thousands. These are the deserted medieval villages, settlements that simply stopped, that reached the end of their demographic viability during the plague years and did not recover. The people who lived in them are gone. The names of most of them are gone. What remains is the shape of the place, the lines of the house platforms, the hollow ways worn by feet and cartwheels into the soil over generations, the outlines of the field strips that fed the community, all of it preserved in grass and silence. Archaeologists who excavate these sites find consistently evidence of ordinary life interrupted rather than concluded. Not the evidence of sudden catastrophe, not burned buildings or scattered skeletons, but the evidence of gradual departure. A hearth with ash still in it, a broken pot repaired and then abandoned, the pits that held grain stores empty, the bones of animals that were kept and tended and eventually slaughtered or simply left when the keeping became impossible. The village did not end dramatically, it drained away. The last family to leave walked down the hollow way and did not come back, and the grass grew over the path and the sheep moved in and the centuries accumulated on top, and now all that is left is the shape of the thing that was there. That image, the grass-covered outline of a life that ended not with a final gesture but with a quiet departure, seems to me to hold something true about the larger story this video has been telling. The ancient world did not end, it was not concluded. It was departed from gradually, unevenly, incompletely, by people who built something else on top of it. And then by people who built something else on top of that, each generation inheriting the shape of what had gone before, without always knowing what they were standing on. The danger did not end either. It changed form. It became in many places and for many people considerably less immediate than it had been. But the human body that navigates the modern world is still the ancient body, still carrying the ancient calibration, still responding to the ancient logic of threat and scarcity and social belonging and the need to be somewhere safe when darkness comes. And now the pace of this slows, because this is where the story releases its hold a little, where the weight of it lifts slightly and what's left is something simpler. You are here. That is not a trivial fact. It is, in the context of everything just described, a genuinely extraordinary one. The average person alive today in a stable, moderately prosperous country has a relationship with death that would have been unrecognizable to virtually every human being who lived before roughly the 19th century. Death is distant for most of us. It happens in hospitals behind closed doors at ages that would have seemed impossible to anyone living in a Neolithic farming village or a medieval city, or a Bronze Age settlement in the shadow of a fault line. The infant mortality rate that was once between 1/3 and 1/2 of all births is now in many countries less than 0.5%. The diseases that once moved through populations like fire, smallpox, cholera, typhoid, plague, are either eliminated or controlled to the point of rarity. The famines that once arrived with the regularity of bad weather have not disappeared from the world, but they have retreated from the lives of a larger proportion of humanity than at any previous point in history. This is not a reason for complacency. The vulnerabilities described in this video have not been abolished. They have been pushed back unevenly and partially by systems and institutions and knowledge that are themselves fragile in ways we do not always appreciate until they fail. Climate remains variable and is becoming more so. Pathogens continue to evolve. The social fabric that amplifies individual resilience into collective survival requires maintenance and investment that is not guaranteed. The geological substrate beneath our cities is no more stable than it was beneath Antioch. The lessons of the past are not self-executing, but the distance between then and now is real, and sitting with it honestly, not with triumphalism which would be both premature and unearned, but with a kind of quiet, clear-eyed recognition of what was overcome and what it cost, seems like the right response to a story of this scope and this duration. The people who are gone left more than bones. They left the world, they made the world habitable in the literal sense. They cleared it, irrigated it, mapped it, named it, organized it into the forms that made larger and larger populations possible. They built the institutions imperfect and often unjust that pooled resources and distributed knowledge and enforced the obligations of the strong toward the weak with enough consistency to matter. They absorb the plagues and the famines and the volcanic winters and the violence and the slow grinding of the body against the conditions of existence, and they persisted anyway. Not because persistence was guaranteed, but because the alternative was silence. And most of them, most of the time, were not ready for silence. That is the thing that stays. Not the death toll, enormous as it was, not the catalogue of catastrophes. Those are real and they deserve the honest accounting this video has tried to give them. What stays is the persistence. The spring planting after the famine year. The wall rebuilt after the earthquake. The infant carried through the weaning crisis and into a childhood marked by illness, and out the other side into an adulthood that produced more children who survived. The community that came back to the same seismically active ground, because the river was there and the soil was good and this was home and there was no better option. The slow, unglamorous, unrecorded work of continuing. Most of it was never written down. Most of the people who did it had no expectation that anyone would know their names, because most people in the ancient world understood in a way that modern life makes easy to forget that they were not the main story. They were one thread in a fabric so large that no single life could see its edges. And yet here is the fabric, here in the dark, in whatever warmth you have made for yourself tonight, in a body that carries without knowing it the whole long argument of its ancestors, with a world that tried repeatedly and in many different ways to end the line. The line did not end. You are the line. And somewhere outside, the same stars that look down on Antioch and the Mesopotamian floodplain and the ash-covered fields of post-eruption Central America and the hollow ways of the English plague villages are still doing what they always did. Shining without awareness, indifferent and beautiful. The same stars, still there.